So, good morning, everybody. Welcome, welcome, welcome to the Wilhelmina Johnson Center. My name is Nkwanda Ja. I am the Executive Director for the Cultural Arts Coalition. We're a nonprofit, community-based organization. We are 40 years old, and we've been housed in this building for about 35 years. As a part, so I'm going to do my whole thing now? No. Okay. So we're just doing introductions now, and thank you for your patience with us with our technical setup here. Bathrooms are right in the hallway there. Water. Please ask if you need anything else. This is the mic, guys.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Oh, okay. I'm sketched. Good morning, everyone. I'm starting off the wrong way this morning. I'm John R. Nelson, Sr. from Jefferson County, Monticello, Florida, near the capital of Tallahassee, about 26 miles to the east of Tallahassee. So I'm a Seminole in Gator Country. But, of course, I've got a daughter who's at the University of Tampa and also is a Gator, and my son, who wanted to be a Gator, 6'8", 290 pounds, wanted to play football here, but he went on to FSU. And, of course, glad to be here this morning. And I want to say hello to my friend that I invited, Dr. Larry Latson, who lives in the Gainesville area as a member of the Churches of God in Unity that I'm affiliated with. Glad to be here.
Good morning. My name is Vivian Filer, and I'm excited to be here as well. To have young people come home is very important and very exciting. So I'm glad that our Gainesville-born young person came back. I'm talking about your leader here to Gainesville. But anyway, I chair the restoration of a historic building called the Cotton Club Museum and Cultural Center, Inc. You'll be going over there later. But my history in Gainesville stretches far, far, far to the back. Part of the 1900s. So I'd like to share a lot with you, and I want to welcome you to Gainesville.
Greetings. I'm Aljanatu Rosemary Florence, and I'm from Ocala. Now, I'm a Bison. I attended Howard University, but my family, they are all Rattlers. So, but I can be a Gator in Gator Country. Dr. Ryan Marino invited me, and I'm very grateful to be here, to be able to just fellowship with you and have a conversation. So, thank you.
Good morning. Glad to be here with everyone. I'm Dr. Simmons, Gwendolyn Zohara Simmons, just recently, maybe not even a month ago, retired from the University of Florida, teaching religion and African American studies and civil rights history. Nice to meet you. Look forward to our conversation.
I forgot to claim my place in the swamp. I am a Gator, 1972 graduate, and Bethune-Cookman University supporter.
I'm neither. So we'll have Lakeisha to introduce her group.
Well, hello, everyone. I am Lieutenant Colonel Keisha Harvin. It is definitely a pleasure to be back home. Now, I will say, because everybody was representing their schools, I have to, too. So, Florida A&M University undergrad. So, I'm a Rattler, and I'm also a Gator, because University of Florida Law School. So I'm very happy to be back and to share with you, have our cadets here to learn more about the history of civil rights in the Gainesville area and with just your own history. So this is a big deal for us. Dr. Goldstein will talk more about the history of our program. But again, we're happy to be with you. Thank you so much for welcoming us here. Okay. And then I'm going to start with the cadets. The cadets are going to go through and introduce themselves.
Morning, everyone. I'm Lauren Harpole. I am going into my second year at West Point, and I'm from Indiana.
Morning, everyone. Thank you for letting us be here. I'm Isabella Regine. I'm also going to be a sophomore, and I'm from Rhode Island.
Hello, everybody. I'm Ryan Hogan. I'm also going to be a Yuck sophomore, and I'm from Denver, Colorado.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Olivia Johnson. I'm from Las Vegas, and I'm actually going to be going into my third year at West Point, so I'll be a junior next year.
Good morning. I'm Peter Schrader. I'm from Lafayette, Indiana, and I'll be a second-year cadet.
Hi, how y'all? I'm Gavin Shapiro, and I'm from Pine Bluff, Arkansas, and I'm going into my second year as well.
Hi, good morning. My name is Amy McCarthy, and I teach law at West Point, and I'm originally from Massachusetts.
Hi, my name is Robert Goldstein. I was sitting down trying to figure all this out. I'm a knight, red storm, bulldog, setter. Try to figure that out. No, I'm a professor of law at West Point, and I started this program 7 years ago to study civil rights law. We had a history component. We had always had a history professor with us. We don't anymore. We sort of changed our focus over the last 7 years. 7 years ago, you will remember that Barack Obama was the President of the United States. We started doing this by it's called a staff ride. In the Army, officers study battles with using the device of a staff ride. So they take the officers out to the battlefield, and they study how the tactics were used and how the battle progressed. And that was, I thought, a great model for us to study the civil rights movement. And when I say the civil rights movement, I don't have to tell you guys that we're talking about 400 years of civil rights movement. It's not the period that's limited to the 1960s. This is not we're not doing a nostalgia tour of the 1960s civil rights movement. But after 2014, I sort of realized that we have to focus more on the present. And so our mission is really to study the history of the long civil rights movement and understand, especially in terms of law, because law, for the vast majority of those 400 years was lined up against the idea of civil rights. In other words, not just not letting it happen, but affirmatively enforcing that it could not happen. And the residuals, all the things that are left over from those laws, some of the laws are still in effect that are affecting the situation. But all those residuals are what we focus on and we study. So on this trip, this is not a trip that's focused on the South. We're going to head north. We're going to study places like St. Louis and Detroit and Pittsburgh, and we do it as an intense academic experience. It's a very rigorous course. So these cadets, by the end of the trip, They've had a week in the classroom before we left. By the end of the trip, they'll have read, they better have read, 6 books. And I could bring in a syllabus to before we leave to show you the many, many articles, some of which they read in anticipation of individual places that we're going to visit, some of which they read to understand the bigger picture. And they get graded on this. So, you can have input into their grades if you see them performing well. But it's such a pleasure to be here. We're very grateful for you hosting us and for all your participation and assistance with this project. And I'm very excited, so I'm not going to talk anymore.
Okay, so I'm going to start and I'm going to sit, okay? It's a lot older than you all. So my degree is actually from the streets of Gainesville. I came to Gainesville in the early 70s to party. Because I'm from a rural community about 30 miles east of here called Grandin, and we didn't even have a stoplight, much less anywhere to party. And we had some what was called juke joints around the area, and I definitely frequented those, but Gainesville, city lights. So that's how I got here. I was fortunate enough to connect with people who like to party and like to do community activism, and started hanging out with them. And actually, the community activism kind of took the lead in it. So I was writing poetry, and I've been reading my poetry to some people, and they said, you really should read your poetry out in audiences, it'll make it stronger and better. So I started to put together a poetry reading, and I didn't want to just be just my poetry, so I thought, I'll get somebody to sing. So I found somebody who said they'd come and sing, and I was like, well, maybe we should just have a couple pieces of art in the room, to make the room look nice. So we got a couple pieces of art, and then I was like, wow, a dancer would be good too. So I happened to have made acquaintance with someone with Laverne Porter Dancers, which is a traditional. That's the dance group as far as history goes here in Gainesville. So I asked one of her dancers if they would dance, and she said, sure. So at the same time, my community activist friends noticed that this community was starting to get a flavor of gentrification, moving people out who'd been here forever to move people in, and then the people who were here before, they weren't going to be able to afford to live here anymore. So we said, let's bring the festival over. Let's bring the poetry reading to the community. Use the poetry reading as a way to gather people, and once you gather people, then you give them information. That was 39 years ago. We just celebrated our 40th year. See when you get this. We just celebrated our 40th festival. It has grown from a couple of hours and less than 100 people to a 3-day event where we go into the schools and we introduce art, and we try to do the history. We've kept the history up front of this community, of our work. Well, I have other brochures. I didn't know it was going to be this many of you all, but I can get you more brochures. This community is Fifth Avenue Seminary Lane, and this is where African Americans moved to when they were released from the local plantations. They came and set up their own businesses. This was a self-sustaining community. Anything that you wanted was here. Food, hotels, just anything. You wanted shoes, clothing, your hair done, photography, churches, all of that was right here. And I forgot to tell you, this building was built as a fire station. You're sitting down in the room where the truck was parked at. The fire station did not stay open very long because of the racial tensions in this community. So they moved it out, and this building has been many, many things since then. My organization, our main focus is to use Cultural Arts Coalition as a vehicle to get information into our community. That has always been our goal, to support our community whenever it's necessary. The problem that we had when we started, gentrification, it's gotten a lot worse now. We have students that are attending the University of Florida. This area is where they live now. They've come in, they've taken down single-family housing, and they put up apartments. And these apartments are upward of $700, which is much higher. The average income for this community is $26,000 a year. So that if you're gonna live in one of them, you're either gonna have food or utilities. You're not gonna have it all on the incomes that we have. So therefore, they're moving. The people are having to move out. That's a very serious problem that we're dealing with right now. We're trying, like I said, this is a historic community, and this is what's been done all over the country. It's not just ours, but we have to fight hard, real hard, and we are going down fighting. We hope that the University of Florida will be our partner. They don't seem to be moving in that direction, but like I said, we're going down fighting, and we're fighting for our community because if we don't have these, homelessness is this kind of stuff is a big contributor to homelessness. And homelessness is not always at the homeless shelter. They're in family couches and out on the porch and in cars and, families. That's what happens to them when we push them out of our neighborhoods where they can afford to live. So I just want to close with my organization. We still do the Fifth Avenue Art Festival. We've done youth programs for all of our existence. We have a summer employment program because the environment, if we don't take care of it, none of the rest of it matters. So it is 29 years old, we're getting ready to do our 30th year. It's an employment program. We hire teenagers. We pay them minimum wage for 20 hours a week for 6 weeks in the summer. And we train them for jobs, but it's really to take care of the environment. And our last program is science clubs. We have 6 science clubs in East Gainesville, or the Black community. Our schools aren't doing good. But one of our things is no participation, no right to observation. So if you're not going to do something about a problem, shut up. So we set up these science clubs, and our kids are loving science. We have, when we say science, we mean science, physics, chemistry, biology, all of it. They do activity, hands-on, no lecturing. It's just hands-on, so our kids have lots of fun. And once again, thank you for coming.
And I guess it's on me now. Good morning again. And Colonel Harvin, yes, I'm also a rattler too. I didn't name all of the University of Georgia, Crawford University up in Atlanta, and so forth and so on. And of course, again, I'm really delighted and grateful to be here. And of course, you can see the attire I match with you because you are actually going to be walking in my footsteps as you go through your careers and everything. But let me just say I'm going to try to stay within my time limit, which is no more than 12 minutes. So I did a little script to help me out. But to give you the kind of my civil rights involvement, it starts with Monticello, Florida, which provided the ideal backdrop for civil rights activities. It's a rural community, a small community, probably at that time less than 10,000 people. 2 schools, one white, Jefferson County High School, one black, Howard Academy High School. The school district actually practiced what we call the separate but not equal doctrine. And of course, we received the used textbooks that came from Jefferson County High School to Howard High School, while the white kids received the new textbooks. But blacks were not allowed on the campus of Jefferson County High School. And of course, whites could come on Howard, but they didn't have a need to. See, the Monticello Jefferson County community featured open racism, bigotry, and discrimination. And that was because you had the white water fountain and you had the black water fountain. You had the black bathroom and the white bathroom. Of course, the black bathroom was up under the courthouse. And then you had other things that you would run into. You couldn't go in and order a meal at a restaurant. You had to go to the back and ask somebody to bring something out and you paid for it. And of course, there were other things that I experienced as a very young toddler. When I would look for work on Saturday morning, I had a rake, and that's how I made my little earnings. My mother didn't have the ability to provide all of the finance that I needed. So at a young age, I started to really go around and rake yards. Made $1.50 or $2, and of course, there were other things about my history that I made a nickel and I made a dime and things of that nature. But I made a mistake of knocking on the front door of white folk asking to rake their yard. And of course, those adults would yell at me and say, "Boy, go to the back." And I would go to the back, obeying their command, and say, "Ma'am, sir, may I rake your yard?" And the answer, and I would say the majority of the time, "No, get out of here." That's the kind of environment that I actually was subjected to. But strangely enough, my playmates at a young age was Tommy and Howard Drawdy and Jack Youngblood. Anybody know who Jack Youngblood was? Jack Youngblood was a star defensive end at Jefferson County High School, same age I was. Came here to the University of Florida, became an All-American. Went on to actually play for the Los Angeles Rams. Anybody remember of course you're quite young, Fearsome Foursome, Lamar Lundy, Marilyn Olsen, Roosevelt Grier, all of those guys, they were what I call the premier defensive team in the NFL. Jack Youngblood was an All-Pro and actually many, many years enjoying that group. Came through here, through Monticello. And of course, there were other athletes, James Mass and others that came in and everything. So you see me wearing this attire. I'm 71 years old. Vietnam War veteran, 1968-69. I have to take 8 medications in the morning and 5 at night because of the things that I was exposed to in Vietnam. But I'm alive and here. And of course, one of the things that you'll learn later on, I am considered to be an ambassador, an unofficial ambassador for justice and equality. And that's been a part of my career. So I hope to be able to tell you a little bit about that as we go into it. And of course, Howard, Tommy, Jack, we all graduated in 1966. I graduated, honor graduated from Howard Academy. Of course, Howard, Tommy, and of course, Jack came on here to the University of Florida. But there was a miraculous thing that happened in 1964 that really drew me into civil rights. Some black kids became dissatisfied with the conditions at Howard Academy second-class education, second-class books. And so without the approval of the principal, those kids led by Fred Sanders, who was a star football player, played center, led a group of students, and the principal almost had a heart attack. From the rural side of, see, we were on one side of the railroad track and the whites were on the other side. Fred led a group of young kids, and I know not to really follow those because my mom would have probably pretty well put a whipping on me that was just unmercifully. But anyway, Fred led those kids from Howard Academy on 2nd Street in the black community all the way from Jefferson County High School, where the superintendent of school office was located. And of course, his demand and the kids' demand was that they wanted equal education and the ability and the opportunity to enroll in Jefferson County High School. And of course, you can imagine, thunder actually let loose. That didn't set too well. Not only that, with the administration and the school system at Howard, because we did something that, when I say we, I was kind of on the backside of it, and you learn how I kind of played the backside role and stayed really at peace with my mom. But what happened primarily is that the clergy started meeting with white leaders, and there were other leaders from the community that met to try to resolve the issue. That was very unusual situation for Jefferson County, being rural Monticello, although Tallahassee had experienced the 1963 bus boycott. So here it was 1964. It had spilled over to Jefferson County, Monticello. And what was happening? Those organizational leaders from the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, of course, we always had the NAACP, and of course, the Voter League, led by Reverend Sylvester Stewart, to start registering black folk to vote. And of course, CORE really actually advocated that black folks should start running for political office. And those are some of the things that happened. And of course, what the committee, they formed what we call a biracial committee. And that committee came up in 1965 with a form called the freedom of choice. It meant that parent, black and white, could actually select either Howard Academy or Jefferson County High School. Guess what? Folk were afraid from the black community because they knew exactly what the environment would be if they went to Jefferson County High School. But some folk were very brave, and there were people such as the Websters, and of course the Websters today have 5 PhDs and 2 MDs out of that family. The Websters, the Seabrooks, the Siplins, the Gallons, Stewarts, Jones, and others enrolled their children at Jefferson County High School in 1965. And of course, thunder really broke loose like you wouldn't believe. Those kids were spat on. They were called names that you wouldn't even dream of. Dr. Webster and I talked today about some of those experiences. He's a practicing medical doctor in Tallahassee, and we often go back and talk about those things. And basically what happened after that, exactly what most people would really look for. Those leading citizens, Siplins, the Websters, the Jones, the Seabrooks, George Siplin, Curly Seabrooks, and some of the others, Eddie Gallon Sr., were fired the next day from their job. And those people had worked for 25 and 30 years for prominent whites, but they were fired as a retaliation. That's what that brought on. But it did not faze the spirit of those leaders. They were profoundly behind their families, and they wanted to make a difference in the community of Jefferson County. Of course, what happened from that, it created what we call the rallying points, and some of the civil rights leaders know that before a major event, we would have the rallies at the church. Memorial Missionary Baptist Church was the headquarters for bringing in attorneys, Attorney John Dew, Kent Spriggs from Tallahassee, Spivey Gordon from Alabama, who were affiliated with the Congress of Racial Equality. They came to Monticello and rallied folk to say, hey, we got to change this community and make a difference. And here, little old me, my mom thought I was the nicest guy that she's ever raised. Very quiet, didn't say a lot, but I would slip out in the evening to go and sit in the back of Memorial Missionary Baptist Church just to listen to those civil rights leaders, those NAACP speeches. And it really caught on to me. I made the decision at that time that I would be an unofficial ambassador for justice and equality. And so here it is today, 71 years old, and I'm still out there advocating that we make change. And I'll tell you about some of those things that you as cadets are coming along. In my career, I secretly practiced some of that right in the middle of state government, city government, and all of those things, but it was really a profound practice, and it got results. Let me quickly share with you some of the things. I started out primarily after graduating from the school, and what happened was in 1974, when I came back to Monticello after my military service, and hopefully that you got a copy of some of the stuff that I sent to Colonel Harvin. In the military, I went on to actually make Soldier of the Year for the 15th Aviation Group. I was in aviation, and of course, Vietnam, 1968-69, the period that saw a lot of people killed. I was in the middle of that, saw some horrific things. I was in the hospital with people that had been shot up and really in pretty bad shape. So I'm just blessed to be here today. But in 74, and I came back to Monticello from 71 to 74 in the Army Reserves out of St. Louis. I came back to Monticello, and of course, some miraculous things happened. I call them divine intervention. Pastor or Dr. Latson know what I'm talking about. Some things happen that you just don't know about, and so it probably will be in your life. You really don't know what's going to happen in your life. But in 74, I received a telephone call, and I related to Abram receiving the call from God to leave his house and go into a far country. And I received a telephone call from Sam Madison. Now, Sam Madison Jr. is an all-pro from Monticello who played with the Miami Dolphins and went on to play for the New York Giants when they won the championship. And today he is a defensive back coach for Kansas City Chiefs. And what happened primarily was I was asked to come to work as a firefighter. So I'm in an environment that is really, really, I'm comfortable. And so, yes, I did. Through the CETA program, Comprehensive Education Training Act, I was funded through the city to go to the fire college in Ocala, right down the road. And of course, I received all my certification qualifications from that college, Florida State Fire College. Came back, and probably within a year, I received another call from City Manager John Parker. John Nelson, early that morning, you need to come to my office. I'm saying, oh my goodness, what did I do? That was the first thing in my mind. But when I came to City Manager Parker's office, this was in the earlier part of 1975, first thing he said, I want you to be my fire chief. I could not believe what he was telling me, because a lot of the folk were senior people ahead of me and everything. I said, Senator Manager Parker, are you really for real? He said, I would not have called you if I were not for real. I said, do you realize this is Monticello? This is still the South. Nothing has changed. There's never been a black at the head of anything in city government. Of course, I was representing the city and the county. And I thought about it, and I said, are you sure? If you're sure and you got my back, I will accept. So I accepted in 1975, became Florida's second African-American fire chief. Only Leroy Smith over in Halifax, Daytona Beach, had become chief prior to me becoming chief. And of course, I became the first black chief of Monticello and Jefferson County. And that's history because I did things that most folk probably wouldn't have done. All righty, what happened, it goes on for there. And there are many other things at Civil Rights Movement that we'll talk about a little later.
Well, I enjoyed listening to that. I don't know if you all, but we learn a lot. You know, when I thought about I heard Ms. Nkwanda talk about gentrification, and I thought, really, you really need to understand what that means to us. It means giving up what our ancestors left for us. It means homes that they fought for, they worked hard for, land they accumulated through strain and through a lot of hard work, and to have it taken away, I essentially say, because families have allowed white businesses, white families, others to come in, buy their land for little or no money, and then use that land to become millionaires. It's all around the city. I think about out on 34th around, is that 43rd? All of that land out there belonged to African Americans. Now, it's a mecca of businesses. And those families did not gain much from selling their land, but it's all gone. But it's happening everywhere in my neighborhood, as you will see later. I wanted to bring that up, but I have a lot going on here. The first thing I have going on is that I'm the oldest person in this room. And in my culture, that demands a lot of respect. And I don't have any problem asking for it either. Wherever I go, if I walk up to a window, they ask me, what's your name, because they're going to call it out later, I say, Miss Vivian. I am not going to be called Vivian by anybody your age, because that's not respectful. I didn't do it, and you're not going to do it to me. Now, why is that important? Well, you heard earlier about going to the back door and all of that. Well, we had to do that. And we had to call the little children. My mother was a maid. The little children, Miss Ann. And there my mother was. They called her Lucille. So now we've come out of the era. Everybody's comfortable with first names. My age group is not comfortable with you calling us by our first name. You have to put what my data call a handle on it.
That's right.
The handle is Mr. or Mrs. or Aunt or something. And down south, white folk did not want to use a handle, a respectful one, so they called the older ladies Annie. That was a put down. Uncle so-and-so. That was a put down because they didn't want to say Mr. or Mrs. to them. They felt a little strange because down south, all of us, black and white, are respectful, I think, of age. And so for that reason, it is important to know that. And it sounds picky sometimes when I do it, sign my name Mrs., but I'm doing that because history has taught me that that's a right I had to fight for. And my age had to fight for, and I just demanded. I don't have any problem with anybody telling them that. The people at this, they know that if I need to say it, here it comes. My sister say, I have no filter. Well, I'm 81, I'm not getting one now. So, but it is what it is. So my beginning was in a very small city called Trenton, Florida, which is 38 miles down toward Tallahassee. My daddy spelled it T-R-E-N-T-O-N, Trenton, because that's where we were from. Now, that has a lot of good memories and a lot of sad memories. I started school in a one-room schoolhouse. The entire school was about the size of this room. 3 or 4 grades were in there. Every 2 rows was a grade. So when I started first grade, I knew all the first grade books. I read them all. I knew them all. I knew everything. So I spent 2 weeks in first grade. And then they moved me over to the second group of seats, which was the second grade, which was exciting for me, but my sister was very unhappy because she spent a whole year in first grade. And there I had caught up with her all of a sudden. But I had been reading the book she brought home and all that, things she knew. So I knew as much as she did. So then we traveled through high school and everything together. So that wasn't good. But in this one-room schoolhouse, the things I talked about were the things that we were taught: manners. We were taught our ABCs. We had to be taught to be mindful of white folk and what we said and how we said it, how we did eye contact, no eye contact, and all of those were important. Oh, I have a TED Talk, if you want, and it's about this. It's called Lessons from My Sidewalk, Vivian Filer. You'll hear me talk more about that, and I'll give you that later. I grew up in Gainesville, Florida, long before the beginning of desegregation. If I remove the head wrap that I'm wearing, you would see a lot of gray hair, and that would give you some indication of how long ago that was. Not only were black people living under the practice of segregation, but there were another set of laws known as the Jim Crow laws. Those laws were in place just to make sure that black people were treated as second-class citizens. Some of the examples of how that was done: if a black man and a white woman were meeting each other on the sidewalk, the black man had to step off of the sidewalk until the white woman passed. And if a white woman was picking her maid up to take her to work, the black woman knew that she had to sit in the back seat of the car. If you passed a group of men on a construction job on the side of the road, didn't matter how many black men there were, the lone white man was the boss. Those are just a few examples of how Jim Crow law was carried out. Now, there were many other portions of that law, factions of that law, divisions of that law that all black parents had to know, practice, and to teach their children. They did that just to make sure their children were safe. So parents told their children, as my mother did, learn to stay in your place. Learn to follow the Jim Crow laws, is what she was saying. That was in my head as a tape all the time. But my sister and I had to walk to school every day. And we walked past a white family's house where two girls lived that were just about our age. They thought it was their privilege every day to taunt us as we passed. They came out and blocked the sidewalk, so my sister and I had to step off into the street. And we did, because you see, I'm listening to my mother's voice saying, "Vivian, stay in your place." I tell you, that was hard. But one day, that went on for about a month, until one day, I did not hear my mother's voice quite so clearly. I decided I was staying on the sidewalk. So as I approached these girls, the closer I got to them, I dropped my notebook on the sidewalk, walked straight ahead. When I was near enough to them, I know they saw the venom in my eyes, because they retreated to their yard and then eventually to the porch. I picked up my notebook, my sister and I walked on, and at that very moment, the calmness I felt was because I had claimed my place on the sidewalk. My resolve was to never give it up. That resolve served me well, because along with it came a desire to fend for myself. But I wanted to tell you about the one-room schoolhouse because when we came to Gainesville, we came to Lincoln, which is right farther down. It was the school started by the most brilliant man I'll ever think of, Mr. A. Quinn Jones, and there's a museum for him. But he brought high school to here, to Gainesville. He did a lot for education here, and he was my principal. I remember him standing in the hall watching us pass by, and he was very mindful of everything. I didn't think he knew who I was. My mother had 3 daughters. Until one day my mother went to visit, and he said, "Oh yeah, the girls are doing fine. This one is there and there." And I thought, oh my God, I better behave myself for sure, because the principal knows who I am. But I said that because that school was more than ABCs and 3 + 3 = 6. It was manners, it was home. There were people there who you're going to see at church and at the store. So they were instrumental in making sure that what you needed to do, you're going to do. Because there was an acquaintance between teacher, mother, principal, everybody. I learned a lot there. A lot from my civics teacher, who was a monumental man, Mr. Tom Coward. He was right out of the service, has just started to teach. And he was my teacher. Another big monumental person, I think, in Gainesville, Florida, was Mr. John Dukes. He graduated Lincoln High School. He went off to the service. He came back to teach. We were in his first class. And I say that because I learned so much from these people. They'd gone away, they come back home. I'm a storyteller. I do a piece called Bring That College Home. So that's what they did. And they were very, very important to the growth. Mr. Coward became a commissioner, first black commissioner. He was really outstanding. Mr. Duke's a great educator, became a principal. There's a school place named after him and all of that. But that was important. But let me regress and go back to Trenton. Before we left Trenton, Florida, my dad was known as the mechanic. They call him Pedro. You know, if a car stopped anywhere in the middle of the night, go get Pedro. That's what he'd do. But my dad was taking care of a house somewhere in Perry, Florida. And it was in Old Town. Wasn't in Trenton, where he knew everybody and worked for the prominent white family at the garage there. Well, there was a lady hit his car. He was driving an old buggy. And she was killed. And they formed a group together, and they took my dad to jail because it was his car that she hit. And they were going to lynch my dad. They got in a group together and all, and Mr. Cecil Rouse was his name, I'll never forget, my daddy telling the story. He heard about it and went to Trenton to tell the folk that my dad worked for, and they came and brought their group and ran this group away and took my dad home. But that's how close it was to getting lynched. No trial, no anything, just that a white woman was killed, and he had to pay the price. So I live with learning that story, but there are many other devastating stories that were part of my life that I heard about the horrible things my parents and their family went through under the civil rights, under no civil rights, under the Jim Crow law, including going to my grandmother in Georgia and picking the cotton and pulling it was a long sheet, but 3 times longer, that my grandmother would put over her arm like this and drag along, because when she picked the cotton, she'd throw it back, pick the cotton, throw it back. Sometimes we'd ride on it, she didn't know. But anyway, that didn't help her. But I tell you these memories because when I go to speak with the group, I tell them, I want you to know history. I'm glad you're reading books. I always tell folk you won't know Black history if you read white books only. And we've been researched all over the place. Everybody's looked up and down, and they think they know us. They don't. Black folk know us. We know us. So if you don't read the books we wrote, you don't know what thus said the Black folk. Now, but put a little quote on that. You won't know what thus said the Black folk if you don't read what the Black folks wrote. Because I have a feeling that I can say something and do something among my peers that are all of the face that I have. I don't have to explain it. It's understood. Because we're on the same page. Our history is there. And that's not just true for us. It's true for any group that's the minority group, for sure. Because whose history has been written? Not ours. His story. That's true. That means the white man's story. Well, you'll know before you're done that I have no trouble telling the story the way I see it. And the way I see it is that we are going to have our rights. We are going to insist on having our rights. We are going to stand. I've been on almost every single committee and board. I'm an activist as well in Gainesville. Why? Because I always felt that if you weren't sitting at the table, you were going to be on the table. And I didn't have anybody to sit at the table, so I was going to be there. I've been on boards that went around and introduced themselves, and I would tell them, you put me on this board Black. If you didn't want a Black person, you need to take me off this board and get you somebody else. It won't always be important for me to address the Black issue because it will be just a person issue or a community issue. But if the occasion arises, you're going to hear what thus said the Black folks, a la Vivian, during that time. So, and you know, I really thank the Lord God for giving me the strength to do that, because it surely is not me, but I'm enjoying it. Anyway, we heard about the Laverne Porter dances. I am ancient. I'm one of the 2 people that discovered Laverne Porter. She's going to do, and she was 16 or 14 when she first started. And we saw her because my friend Mary Webb came to Gainesville, became a civil rights worker along with me. Mary was white, but Mary was just such a friend and such an activist herself. She wanted to teach dance. Now, Mary was a terrible dancer. I tell you that. She's coming back to town, but Mary was terrible. But she could teach dance. And we found Laverne and taught her, and she became the mother of modern dance in Gainesville, Florida. And I like that part of that. I talked about school in Trenton. When we came here, I came to Lincoln High School. Downstairs at Lincoln was elementary. Upstairs was high school. I finished there in 1956 under Mr. Aquin Jones. And went on to, I got married and was married 10 years before university was integrated. Santa Fe opened in 68, and it opened integrated. So I worked nights as a nurse aide, married with 2 children. And that's the way I was able to go to school. Once I finished Santa Fe with my associate degree, the university was finally integrated, and I became one of the members of about the second or third integrated group of nursing students there at University of Florida. Received my bachelor's degree there in 1972. It was hard because I came out of Lincoln High School. They didn't give us the high sciences. And in almost everything we had, Mr. McGee, our science teacher, had to buy the Bunsen burners, had to buy the things that we were going to mix together out of his little salary. But he did all he could to teach us everything we had. When there became a time that we were finally going to integrate the LPN, Licensed Practical Nursing Program, they were going to allow blacks to come in. So there was never a test for this now. But the minute they were going to allow blacks to come in, they said we had to take a test. Mr. John Dukes called all of us in that wanted to do that and said they're going to be heavy on math. I want to make sure that you know this math. And he tutored us. So I took the test. And then I went in to see about it, and she said, well, you passed, and you scored so high. Where did you go to school? How did you do this? I said, I went to Lincoln High School. And she said, well, you can get in. You know, you made this high score. I didn't go to LPN school. I said, if I did that well, I can be a registered nurse. I will not do that. So I went back into my nurse's aide. Years later, when I received all these degrees and went back to teach at Santa Fe College, this person was one of the assistant directors of nursing, as I was, and I had the occasion to have lunch with her one day. And I said, I need to tell you something. I need to refer back to a time when we were taking the test to get into the LPN program. And this is what you said to me. She had no memory. She had wiped that from her mind. But I wanted to put it back because here's my philosophy. Black folks got to stop paying the price for what you did, what white folks did. They've got to start paying some price. They've got to figure out some things too. I said we can't always sit at the table and tell our part if you don't tell your part. I want to know what you thought when I walked past your white school in the rain to school to go to my black school, and you were sitting up there dry, warm, looking down at me. What did you think? I said that to a group of friends we were having. I was teaching with them. We were having our retreat for school. And we were sitting around one say, well, I'm from here. I didn't see blacks in my community. They weren't at my church. And then said, well, I'm from here. I didn't see blacks in my community. The third one started to talk. I said, wait a minute. Didn't you wonder where we were? I'm tired of these excuses. Didn't you wonder where we were? I mean, you had to know we existed. You saw us every now and then. We certainly were in your kitchen. So didn't you wonder what happened when we left? You can't sit back and say, I don't have a plug in here. You do. If you're living and breathing, majority, you have a reason to be involved. And I always have to tell that story. I'm a storyteller, as you can tell. I don't do anything without a story. But I've been a storyteller over 60 years, and I use that to go into schools to tell stories so that I can do Black history. I only tell Black stories. And so if you want me and you don't want that, you need to get you somebody else, because that's all I do. And they're not even stories. They are poems written by Black writers. I started to do it because we were losing the work of Black writers. James Weldon Johnson, County Cullen, Langston Hughes, Paul Laurence Dunbar, names you never heard. They were monumental. Paul Laurence Dunbar is my first love. He was one of the first published African-American writers, and he took jobs on both in African-American folk language and in standard English. So anyway, I don't want to get off on that because pretty soon I'll be telling you a story, but you don't want to do that. I remember this as the fire station and the fire truck coming out of here. There were no Black firemen. I remember when it was closed. I remember when we had one Black policeman. He rode a bicycle and had no gun. He rode up and down Fifth Avenue, the Chisholm family. He had no gun. But Black folks respected him. He didn't have to say much. They respected him. You see how white folks felt about it. He had no gun. But he had authority in that. Sergeant Lewis was his name. We'd mind him after school. If he saw Sergeant Lewis, you better be headed home because it was time to do that. So one of the things that I look at as we move forward is that we need some of the old things that we used to have. We didn't have children in foster care because if a Black person passed away or a child was orphaned, some black family on that street took that child in. They decided. So they were raised, oh, no, that's not her real child. That's Miss So-and-so's child, but she passed away, and so this family raised. That's what we did. That's the community that we knew. So we didn't have foster, but we've grown away from that and such, as we should have done. So I started my first job as a maid. I was 14. I convinced my mother that I could do that and still keep my grades up. The competition then wasn't to be the slowest person in class. I had to be at the top. If anybody was going to make an A, I had to be right there. So there were a group of us who were competitive. I told my mother I could still make the grade and work after school because I wanted my own clothes. And, my mother was doing what she could, but she couldn't do all that. And 3 of us wanted to dress alike. So she let me do that. So when I write my resume, which is 5 or 6 pages long, the first thing is maid. You know why? Because I was an honest maid, I was a good maid, and I worked for what I attained. And I want people to know that all of us didn't just walk out of a 5-6 bedroom house and go to college. We came from meager beginnings. And what our ancestors say was, I want you to do better. I work hard, I'll do a piece like that. I want you to do better. And that was my way of paying back. So I'm proud to say I was a member of the first integrated group of women where Gainesville Women for Equal Rights. We were the ones who integrated a lot of places. I chaired the integration committee for the hospitals and the doctor's offices. So out of my committee, we had 4 blacks and 4 white women. We went to the hospital to get them integrated, went to the doctor's office. We used to go all the way to Ocala to the dentist because there was no black dentist here. Finally, we had a black dentist who was awesome, black doctor. Early on, we had a black doctor right on the corner of 10th Street. Did you know that big house? That was a doctor's office at one time. Right there across from where Albert White's place, that big greenhouse. Oh. But I don't remember his name. But anyway, I digress. I'm a part of the civil rights movement, so I know all the marches. I did all of that because, like Ms. Nkwanda say, if you want change and you're not going to be involved in change, don't call me. I've had people to do that. They tell me what's going on, and then I said, well, here's when the commissioners meet. Oh, I want you to do it. I said, that's not going to happen. You need to go speak this out of your own mouth and let me be supportive of you. So all of the things I've done over time, I'm most proud of the fact that I've been able to work with outstanding women and men in this community who have the same view of things that I do. They want to see us move forward, and they want to be a part of what's going in. So let me just make one more point. We mentioned the freedom of choice that happened in Monticello. That was a law, as you probably know. It was an escape for Southern schools to say, put the emphasis on us again, telling the black family, you've got freedom of choice. If you don't choose, it's not our fault we're not integrated. That's really what they were saying. And black families, some of them weren't choosing because they didn't want to pull their children out and be the first ones to start, or they may have received some other negative things like losing their jobs and those kind of things. So a lot of things will go into your reading that should cover all of that. And I have much more, but I don't want to bore you for the rest of the day. And we'll have more time to talk. But this community, I lived in this community on 7th Avenue when we first came to Gainesville. And I lived on both sides, so I know the Mecca that was down Seminary Lane. And you could go, our favorite spot was to go to Reverend Cato's Sundry. There, and we would buy cherry Coke. Mine was a cherry Coke and a hot dog. On Saturday night, Mama would let us walk down the street. We couldn't walk on this side because that's where the juke joint and things were. We could cross over and right in front of Reverend Cato's and but they had to get back on the other side because we were the good girl. And people were watching you. Before you could get home, they said, Miss Lucille, I saw that girl, and she was over there and right in front of that place. And then we were in trouble. So we knew the rules, and we knew how to live by the rules. But Reverend Cato was so sweet to us. He would mix, if you have a cherry Coke, you need to try that. That's ice cream and a Coca-Cola mixed together. It's so good. But anyway, and the hot dog. He made the best hot dog. But you could get your clothes cleaned, you could get your hair cut, you could buy shoes, you get your shoes repaired right down that street right there, 5th Avenue, which was now 5th Avenue. Thank you. You're there.
Thank you. So I've enjoyed listening to the other panels talk about their experiences. So when I introduced myself, I didn't tell you a lot about myself, so I'll fill in a few of the blanks. I am a retired school teacher. I'm a student of history, and I've been a community activist since elementary school, and I'm also a global missionary. So I've gone to Haiti and Africa, and so I'm going to talk a little bit about my journey. So first of all, I want to say that I'm very pleased that the cadets are here, and I'm very excited about Miss Jag, Miss Felicia, and I consider myself to be from a military family. Now, why I didn't join the military, I was thinking about that just yesterday. That was a war. It was the Vietnam War. And so, but my dad served in Korea. My son served in Afghanistan. I have a brother-in-law, a sister-in-law. I have 4 of my 5 brothers, a host of uncles and nieces and nephews who have all served. So I feel a certain kind of kindred, even though I didn't serve. But as you know, when you serve, your family serve. So thank you guys. Now, I grew up in Jacksonville, and I went to a Catholic school, and I was raised up in the Catholic Church. So my first love was Jesus. Just stole my heart right away. I was baptized in 1st grade. And my second love was Toussaint Louverture. So I was in love with him from grade school, and I was so excited to find him in a book. And he was a genius of a military man, and he was given the name, or he chose the name, Louverture, because it means to find an opening. So he was very strategic, and he could find an opening in the enemy's lines. And so he was responsible for the enslaved people in Haiti actually winning their freedom and establishing a country. And that was in 1803. And so rather than wait for the emancipation in 1865 and the war in 1863, I decided that I got my freedom under Toussaint in 1803. So I was always very grateful to Haiti. And so when I had an opportunity to go as a missionary and as a teacher, I was already in love with the people. And I was very grateful for them giving us the idea that you could be successful. And to know that they fought against Napoleon, I'm like, they beat Napoleon? Yes, and that was one of the reasons the United States grew past the Mississippi, because he kind of hightailed it back to France, and they had the Louisiana Purchase. So as a result, I was like, okay, this is my guy. So now I remember being in 5th grade at school, and John F. Kennedy was running for president. And it was a really big deal because he was Catholic. And Catholics were not seen to be, they weren't seen as real Christians. And so they never had a Catholic president, always Protestant presidents. And so we developed a slogan, and I'm going to date myself. I'll be 69 in August. So I'll be 69 in August. So I'm on the schoolyard, and there was this commercial, and I don't know if any of you guys can help me with this, but it was a chocolate commercial, and it was Nestles, Nestle's make the very best chocolate. That's a commercial. So you guys know that. So what we did is we took Kennedy
and we used that same soundtrack, and we made it Kennedy. Kennedy makes the very best president. And so that was the campaign slogan for us kids in 5th grade in the schoolyard, giving support to John F. Kennedy. So I learned in Catholic school a couple of things. One was to defend your faith, and the other one was to stand for what is right. So as I went forward armed with my principles, it was very easy for me to determine to be a part of the civil rights movement. I remember clearly I was on vacation in Orlando, and having read James Baldwin and Eldridge Cleaver and a lot of other black writers, I was already honing my civil rights mind at that time. But we were in Orlando, my sister and my siblings, and the Orlando Sentinel, on the front page or on one of the pages, there was a picture of children being arrested in Ocala. It wasn't printed in the Ocala paper because the news in Ocala that was about black people was only printed in a certain section and on a certain day. So whatever happened, you'd wait for the day, maybe I think it was like Wednesday, and you'd get a little bit of who died and a little bit of what was going on in the black community. Now, we did have other black newspapers, as the black community has always had black newspapers talking about what's going on in our communities. So my sister and I, we called our parents and said, listen, we want to be a part of the movement. We want to make sure that integration comes to Ocala. So we cut our vacation short, and we came home, and we joined the NAACP youth group, and we were given instructions on how to stay safe and how to behave while you were on the picket lines. And so we demonstrated in front of McCory's and other places that would not allow black people to sit at the lunch counters and be served. And so that was the onset of my being an activist. So fast forward maybe a couple of years later, the county passed a law stating that young people of a certain age could not participate in protests because it would be injurious to their health. You know, rainy weather, cold days. And so that stopped the youth from actually protesting. Now, the students globally, you'll find there's a pattern of students coming out to protest because what are the adults doing? Pretty much they're working. And if they're not working, they've been threatened by their supervisors that if you are caught protesting, that you won't have a job. So my parents were entrepreneurs. My mom had her salon. My dad had his barbershop. So we had a little bit of freedom. And what we decided to do in Ocala, the NAACP spearheaded a legal recourse. We actually filed a court case, Florence versus Marion County. It went to district, and we actually we overturned that ordinance, and we were able to go back and participate. Now, myself as a young person, I remember Kerry Hampton. He's deceased. May he rest in peace. We actually attended the court session. I remember missing school, sitting in the old court in the wooden benches doing the actual hearing. And we were just so happy that that was overturned. And because we felt that we had the right, it was one of the rights that you have as a citizen to be able to protest. So I went on to college. Well, before college, I was one of the first in the black community to integrate the white high school, Ocala High. It was not pretty. We were taunted, teased, and called names, thrown pennies at us. They would throw oranges at us. But we persevered. In order to have been selected to go to the white school, we'd already gathered and parents were talked to, students were talked to. Now, first of all, you had to be able to be nonviolent to be a part of the protest. You could not throw down your picket sign if someone threw something at you and fight. You just had to keep marching and, try and, the thing that we all learned is that first thing you do is cover your face, And if you were knocked to the ground, you kind of want to ball up to cover your midsection. So, my sister did not integrate because she said, I know that I don't have that good nature to just turn the other cheek, so I'm just going to stay at Howard High. so many students, they did other things. They made signs. They participated in the NAACP youth movement in many other ways because, they just didn't have the temperament. But the summer before I started my 10th grade, we actually got together and decided that we would go to summer school because one of the things that the community was saying is that, if your school was black school, it was probably inferior. The kids are probably not going to do well academically. They may want to try a summer program, which you had to pay. So we paid. I took geometry. I excelled in geometry. As a matter of fact, I scored the highest in geometry. And the teachers were surprised to know that as we went through the regular school year, that we were able to achieve high standards and make high marks. I was an honor roll student along with many of the other kids that integrated the schools. So I went to a historically black college, and I specifically chose a historically black college because I knew there was a wealth of information about our people stored in the library and in the instructors, and it was a very wonderful, enlightening experience. And that's where I met two of my mentors, well, three actually. Dean Edna Calhoun, Dean of Housing, she took me under her wings. She's from Fernandina Beach, Florida. And Dr. Chancellor Williams, the author of The Destruction of Black Civilizations. He was my mentor and teacher, and I learned so many things from him. And Stokely Carmichael came back to campus to help organize, and he was also one of my mentors. And I would have to say Kwame Ture, because he did change his name. So as a teacher of history, there were many times that when I talked about and taught African American history during the turbulent times, I would have to do some self-talk. And what I would say to myself, because I would have to say it to my kids, of course I taught in an integrated school, and I would tell the kids, this is a school that I couldn't attend, but I'm teaching here. And wonderful things happened when we approached our history in a way to look at relationships. I had one class to actually apologize to me for the way that my ancestors were treated by their ancestors, and it was a very healing process. So I think that as we continue our journey, there's always something to be done. The struggle continues, and I think that we want to look at both sides of the relationships. I am not a slave. I am a descendant of enslaved people. You, if you're white, or not a slaveholder, but perhaps descendants of slaveholders. But what are we going to do now? And what are our relationships going to be? How are we going to be one community, one people, one nation? That's the challenge that I see that we have before us. And I'm ready and willing to forge new relationships and to learn not just about my culture, but the culture of other people. And as Bob Marley says, until the philosophy of one race superior and another race inferior, until that is abandoned and abolished, then there's always going to be war. So we have to make a reckoning with the inferiority and the superiority that's actually taught. We have to fix that.
Great. God. And wrap it up with Bob Marley.
I couldn't help you with Bob Marley. He's another generation.
I'm embarrassed that I couldn't help you.
I was getting brain freeze there for a moment, but I remembered.
You did good.
I'm assuming you're the moderator. I'm wondering if we should stand up. We've been
and you know I just found that out. Let's stand and let people stretch a little bit.
What we really need to do is get ready for what we're playing, what we're going to hear from this monument. Oh, I am ready. Miss History on the end down here.
Wow, I tell you, it's hard to follow, and I'm the only non-Floridian at this table. And I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee, and so same kinds of conditions that you heard about from everyone else. I grew up in the Jim Crow era, and I'm sure you're familiar with that term. Segregation in every realm was also the case in Tennessee, where I was born and raised. I remember one of the things that awakened me to the terrible injustices that we as African Americans, we were certainly called Negroes then, were subjected to, was seeing the centerfold of the Jet magazine that had Emmett Till's picture in his casket. And I guess I might have been 10 years old. And we, like most black people, got the Jet magazine, which was a black magazine. We got Ebony magazine, another black magazine, delivered to our house so that we could see some positive things about ourselves in print, because in Memphis, as here, you certainly didn't get it in the newspaper, not the major newspaper. We also had a black paper. But to go back to watching, looking at Emmett Till and learning about what had happened to him, I remember saying to myself, I'm going to do something about that. This just cannot go on. I was raised by my grandmother there in Memphis, and unlike many of my peers, my grandmother talked to me about slavery. You might have learned that often black people did not tell their children about the enslavement period. There was a certain amount of shame attached to it. Certainly that's, thank goodness, totally different now, because we know that the shame was not on those of us who were enslaved. The shame was on those who did the enslaving. But my grandmother had been raised by her grandmother. My grandmother's name was Rhoda Douglas, and her grandmother was Lucy Goldsby. And Lucy Goldsby had been born into slavery. And like others, she was the product of rape and had come out looking like her father, who was white and was the slave owner. And so she was blonde and blue-eyed. And when she was 13, she was given to her half-sister as a wedding gift. And unlike what you would have thought, her half-sister hated her because they looked so much alike, and it was clear who the father was. And so she tortured her tremendously all during the rest of the time that my grandmother Lucy was enslaved. And when I was a little girl, my grandmother would tell me the stories that her grandmother told her about what it meant to be an enslaved person and the suffering and all of that. And my grandmother Rhoda would cry as she told the stories. And of course, I being a little girl, I would cry also. So I think those two things had such an imprint on me. I went to an all-black school, of course, and when I left Memphis to go to Spelman College in 1962, the public schools in Memphis had not been integrated. Only what was called Memphis State University at that time, it's now called the University of Memphis, it had begun integrating, and a young man across the street from me, whom I had known all my life, was in that first class. So I remember him coming home and telling us about all of the harassment and hatred that he was shown every day. But he continued and graduated, in 4 years from Memphis State. Anyway, I knew that I was going to college, and I was told that by my grandmother, who had only gone to the 6th grade herself and had been a sharecropper. And so she, like she told me about the enslavement of her grandmother and the suffering, she also told me about sharecropping and the difficulties of bringing in a crop and going the day that the reckoning of the crop was to happen, and to not be able to dispute anything that the white owner said about what you owed, how much the crop had brought in, whether you were going to get anything at the end of the year, or whether you still owed him for the seed, for the food, for the housing, and all of those things. So this was taught to me at home, and I was very, very aware of the injustice of it all. So the civil rights movement, as you guys know, had the modern civil rights era, and I'm so happy that your professor mentioned that the movement began when the first Africans were captured and put on the ships that were brought to the so-called New World, because many of them fought and died, and in a few cases overpowered the ship's captains and took the ships back. So the movement began then. But the civil rights movement, in which I was a part, the 60s, the 50s movement, as you know, 4 young men sat in at a Woolworth's counter in North Carolina, and that is often talked about as one of the kickoffs for the movement. Of course, the earlier period being the Montgomery bus boycott. And the Montgomery bus boycott was something that I remember everybody in my church. I was brought up in the Baptist church, and in my community being so proud of the fact that those people in Montgomery had walked and carpooled and did whatever they needed to do to get where they had to be for a year in order to desegregate the buses. So there was tremendous pride in that. When the 4 young men sat in 1960, there was tremendous pride throughout our communities because of that. And so while this was really impacting on me, and I knew I was going to go away to school, my grandmother had instilled that in me from the earliest days. You are going to college. You're going to be the first one in our family to go. But at the same time, she was well aware that Dr. King was in Atlanta and that there was a movement there. And so she was saying to me, after all of this teaching me about struggle and justice, that I should not get involved. And she made me swear that when I got to Atlanta, I was not going to get involved. In fact, she went with me. She and my mother and my stepdad, they took me there, and the last thing she said to me as she was leaving Spelman College was, I did not bring you here for you to get involved. You were brought here to get an education, and you had better promise me that you're not going to get involved. And I promised her, and I really meant it. I mean, I was so happy to be there. And I the first person in the family, everybody had sent me off with such accolades and little gifts of people putting $2 and $3 in my hand at the church. There was so much joy when any of us did well in my community. And so I had no intention of getting involved. So I get to Spelman, and the first thing, somehow or another, I wind up in a class on American history with a Dr. Staunton Lind. And he was a white professor from Yale who had graduated with his doctorate from Yale. And I had never had a white professor or teacher before, so I had no idea what to expect. There was also another professor there named Howard Zinn, who was a political science professor, even though he was a historian also. And he too had a profound impact on my life, as did Dr. Lind. But this class, unlike any class I had had in American history, focused on the Black resistance to enslavement and to the Jim Crow era, and was encouraging us to get involved in the civil rights movement. So there was one thing happening to undermine this promise that I had made. Of course, the other promise I had made was that I was going to join a church as soon as I put my bag down, and it should be a Baptist church. So as it turned out, there was another freshman in my class who invited me to go to church with her. She said, "This is my sister's church." Her sister was married to Ralph David Abernathy. I had no idea who he was, but of course it was in walking distance. It kind of reminded me of my church, big brick church sitting on a corner. And so there we went, and first time I laid eyes on Reverend Abernathy, and he was preaching about the civil rights movement. And as I learned, he had come from Montgomery, where he'd been one of the leaders of the Montgomery bus boycott and the best friend to Dr. King. So I'm like, oh, wow, okay. So that's the second thing that's beginning to undermine this promise I've made, because every Sunday I'm hearing everybody ought to be involved in the movement. And then maybe about the third or fourth Sunday, there's Dr. King in the pulpit. And I'm like, oh my God, that's Dr. King, you know. And he preaches that day how everybody needs to be involved in the movement, that the time has come. And I'm like, oh my God, what am I going to do? And then there was the third thing was that SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, offices were 2.5 blocks from Spelman's campus. And the SNCC field secretaries, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee people, were on campus every day recruiting for people to go on marches or whatever it was they were involved with. And they were really harsh. You know, they were saying, you're Uncle Tom's, you handkerchief heads, you know, if you're not out here on this picket line, you ain't nothing, you know. And I'm like, oh my God, you know, Uncle Tom, handkerchief head. I mean, no, I'm not. I'm just here trying to get an education. Please don't call me that, you know. And they said, I was in school, I dropped out to work full time. I was like, drop out? I can't think about dropping out. My grandmother will kill me. Oh, no, you know. But, you know, it was really wearing on me. And then, of course, the school didn't want us to get involved. People are often surprised that some of our black colleges, they also put a lot of pressure on us not to get involved. So I felt like I was in a really vice, but I was really being worn down in my classes, in my church, and anytime I walked across the campus, there seemed to be somebody there from SNCC asking me, was I going on some demonstration or not? And I said, I can't go on a demonstration. First of all, Spelman's going to kick me out. I'm going to lose my scholarship. I mean, I'll be disgraced. I can't. And they said, well, you ought to do something for the movement. So I said, well, I have secretarial skills. Can I help out in that way? And they said, well, come on down to the office. Well, going to the office was off limits. And so it meant you had to tell a lie on the sign-out sheet. Let me tell you, back then, you know, we were kept on a very short leash in college. I mean, it was like, I lived in a dormitory that had a house mother who watched you like a hawk. And if you were going anywhere other than to your class, to the library, you had to sign out. And she checked the sheet to see where you said you were going. So if you had put down SNCC office, those were grounds for being kicked out. So, of course, I'd have to get somebody in another dorm to agree if anybody checked that I was going to that dorm to visit them. I mean, it was really fraught with all kinds of dangers just trying to get to the office to help out. So anyway, that's how I got started. I was going there, and, you know, these people were busy. The office was a mess. And I said, well, I can clean up. That'll be a help, you know. So I'll sweep the floors. I'll empty the trash. I can type. I'll type up anything. So I started that way. After a while, when I'd see them getting ready to go on the demonstrations, I felt terrible that I wasn't going. And then they told me, you don't have to go to jail. I said, I can't go to jail. I mean, I just can't. I mean, it'll be the ruination of me. So they said, well, you can march, and then when they tell you to disperse, they give you a few minutes to leave. I said, you sure about that? They said, yes. So, okay, my first march, we're trying to desegregate a big store there called Rich's Department Store that had a very nice dining room. So you could pay your money and shop there, but you could not enter that dining room. So that's what we were protesting. And like they said, when the police came up and said, disperse or be arrested, I ran off. I was so ashamed, you know. And I did that a few times, just trying to make it through that first semester, then the second semester. And I did escape detention, attention from the school. But in the second year there at Spelman, the movement was really raging. That would have been the academic year of 63 to 64. And SNCC was planning Mississippi Freedom Summer. And I, was very well acquainted with everybody in SNCC at the time. When you mentioned Stokely, Carmichael, of course, he was one of the leaders in SNCC and was a fierce person in Mississippi. And I also let myself be nominated to be on SNCC's coordinating committee. And when because SNCC at that time was made up of two representatives, meaning their board, if you will, two representatives from the colleges, black colleges across the South. And so when I permitted my name to be entered into the contest to become one of the representatives from the Atlanta Commission on Human Rights, is what we called ourselves, the civil rights group, made up of all of the black schools, Spelman, Morehouse, Morris Brown, ITC, and Atlanta University. These schools were all right there together. And I was elected, and I knew then that my life had changed and that I better get ready for whatever was going to come down the pike, because as a representative on the SNCC coordinating committee, I became involved in the planning for the Mississippi Freedom Summer Project, and I knew that I had to go. And I knew that there was no way my grandmother was going to permit it. So the other thing, of course, was I was working with Dr. Lind, who was in charge of developing, along with others, the curriculum for the Freedom Schools. And I worked with him on developing those curriculum. I also became bold and went to jail on a demonstration, and of course that just totally blew my cover, both with the school, who immediately called my folks. I was threatened over the phone by my grandmother, who swore she was coming and to beat me within an inch of my life, kind of thing. And it was like, you're the first person in our family to go to jail. How you just cannot do this. And I kept saying, but it's not, I didn't break law. Yes, you did, or you wouldn't go to jail. I was like, but this is right. We have a right to do this. No, you don't. You don't have a right. I mean, on it went. So I was put on probation at school. Anyway, it was interesting. The school claimed they would throw us out, but they didn't. So I realize now that it was a threat to try to keep us from doing these things. But in fact, none of us were thrown out who got involved, because I then sort of began recruiting other students that if a lot of us go to jail, they're not going to throw us all out, So anyway, I am just, it's been an incredible journey. And I know that I have to wrap up, but I did go to Mississippi. I'm sure you've read about Mississippi Freedom Summer. I fell out completely with my family over going, And in fact, when I left to go to Mississippi, first of all, I hadn't planned to go back home to Memphis. But, you know, when you tell people what your plans are, somehow it got back to the dean of students, who then told my folk that I was going to Mississippi. And my grandmother's thing was I had lost my mind, because anybody going to Mississippi talking about bringing about change must be planning to be dead. I mean, that's a suicide mission. You're not doing it. So, of course, I wake up one morning at 6 a.m. with the house mother knocking on my door telling me I had company. And I'm at 6 a.m. in the morning, you don't have company in Spelman. So there was my grandmother and my mother and my stepfather outside my door saying, we've come to take you home before you do something really crazy. And so they did take me home, but I had every intention of getting to Mississippi by hook or crook. And so I called, you know, Spelman, and they sent a check for me to take the bus. Well, my grandmother intercepted that and tore it up. Then I told them, don't send it to my house. You have to send it to a friend's house in my friend's name. Determination. So, of course, she was able to cash it and buy me a bus ticket on the Greyhound bus. I cried all the way to Atlanta because my grandmother said, if you leave, don't ever come back. Anyway, I got to Atlanta, and there was Dr. and Mrs. Lynn waiting for me with my bloodshot eyes to take me to their house, where I stayed until we drove to the orientation session for Mississippi Freedom Summer. Just quickly, that was an incredible experience. Some 900 young people, mostly young, had been recruited to go, and we were broken into two groups. And because I had gone penniless, SNCC put me on payroll immediately after I told them my situation, that I came here with maybe $10 to my name. That's it. I have no money, and my grandmother is not going to give me any, and she's daring my mom and dad to send any. So I don't know what I'm going to do. So they said, well, we'll put you on payroll, and payroll was $10 a week. And after taxes, you got $9.34. So anyway, I went to the summer project orientation, and I know we have to go to the next place. I just wanted to say that I met two of the three workers who I'm sure you've read about, who were killed in Mississippi before I even got there. James Chaney and Andrew Goodman, who were both at the first orientation. Because I had become SNCC staff, I was to stay at both orientations. So I waved them off when the bus left. And in the second week and the second orientation, I guess it might have been on the second day of the second orientation, we were called in and we were told that the three workers had disappeared and that they were surely dead, because there was no way they would disappear. James Chaney was from the area. He knew it well. No way for him to get lost. And Schwerner had already been there for over a year as a volunteer. So we were given the option of going home. They said they had threatened, the Klan had threatened to kill up a bunch of the people coming, and they began by killing that first three. And as I recall, no one left. There were 500 of us in that auditorium when they told us that these three workers had been killed and that we didn't have to go because clearly this was a life and death situation. So just looking forward to sharing with you all more stories of my time in the movement. and also where do we go from here? Thank you.
Oh, wow, this was so special, and I enjoyed everybody's presentation. We're going to get ready to move to the next place, which is the Cotton Club, which is history in and of itself. So,